Hello, I'm Steven, and this is my video about post-punk. So the alternative music landscape between 1976 to 1994 is almost entirely impenetrable. From the death of punk in '78 to the release of Nevermind, the world of quote-unquote rock music is a gigantic mess of subgenres that makes getting into punk music incredibly hard for no reason. We all know that punk was important and influential, but when you Google it and see it only lasted for 2 years, it makes absolutely no sense. First of all, punk really didn't last only 2 years. Really, all of the rock music after punk is a continuation of punk, but because of a lot of really weird circumstances, everything got different names. This is all very stupid. Listen, subgenres are a good tool to describe different sounds in music, but this era is unique in that people fight vehemently against these subgenres being called by any other name. In reality, the differences between a post-punk band like Joy Division and a hardcore band like Black Flag is unlike the differences between a heavy metal band like Led Zeppelin and a folk rock artist like Bob Dylan. But after 1978, music became extremely balkanized, and everyone decided that they needed to have their own name for their own kind of punk rock. Eventually, around the time of Nirvana, umbrella terms like alternative and indie were solidified, along with already existing umbrella terms like hardcore, and most of these subgenres, as well as most rock music today, could be classified into these categories. Nirvana, Green Day, and Weezer are all different subgenres, but if you refer to any of them as alternative, people won't get mad. Bob Dylan, the Beatles, and Led Zeppelin are all different subgenres, but if you refer to any of them as classic rock, people won't get mad. Call a band like Slint post-punk instead of post-hardcore math rock, and someone named Kyle will pee their pants and cry. This is stupid, again, and mostly a product of people trying to make the music they like as inaccessible as possible so that they can feel like the most smartest, coolest, obscurest music enjoyer ever born. Because of all this confusion, this era of music, which is full of incredibly influential and fantastic bands, doesn't get nearly as much attention as it deserves. Like, the music of the early 70s and the music of the 90s are completely different. There was a drastic reworking of the entire musical landscape, and outside of the invention of hip-hop, people only really have a vague idea of how it happened. The fact is, you can track the evolution from this to this to this. I'm so lonely. And this to this to this. Harder, better, faster, stronger. Surprisingly easy. It's just that all the steps are divided into 20 different subgenres, and it makes it difficult. And yes, it's all because of punk, pretty much. Really, with most modern American and British music, if you can't trace it back to late 70s hip-hop, you can trace it back to late 70s punk. I know this is a big claim, but let me try to dissect this mess. Okay, so to start this all off, let's go to where we all know punk started. I'm talking about, of course, Kingston, Jamaica. Yes, seriously, well, kind of. Okay, so punk is officially agreed to have been started in CBGB's in New York because of the Ramones. Here's the thing, the Ramones weren't really trying to do anything special. They just wanted to be like the Rolling Stones, but they couldn't play their instruments well, so they just played simple power chords fast so it wouldn't be noticeable. This was inadvertently innovative because the Ramones came out during the age of Jimmy Page and Pete Townsend. The entire culture based around the concept of untouchable rock gods. If you were in a rock band, you were expected to be a master of your instrument. A guitarist was expected to improvise intricate, complicated riffs. A drummer with a standard 6-piece kit looked like an idiot next to Neil Peart and John Bonham. The least you could do was get a gong and bongos. This discouraged a lot of people who wanted to make music from making it because they knew they weren't gods. When the Ramones came out, people heard it and they're like, oh, I really like this, and these guys aren't even good. I could do that easily. So it inspired a bunch of people to make bands. That's what punk is at its core, an idea that anyone can make music. The look, attitude, and philosophy of punk doesn't really arise in full until bands like the Sex Pistols get their hands on it in England. In the UK, punk reimagines what the counterculture movement was in the 60s. However, there's a long story behind how this happened. Counterculture was essentially based on this philosophical idea of negation, where essentially people did whatever they could to discuss the normal mainstream person as a protest against society. So hippies counteracted the clean-cut 50s by growing their hair out, not showering, doing drugs, having casual sex, and trying to tear down the warlike society. The hippie movement got co-opted into capitalism easily. The system promoted the ideas like peace and love and sold fringe jean vests and peace sign headbands to the teenage public with ease. By the late 60s, it was evident that the hippie movement had failed, and it was starting to seem to a lot of people that most of the hippies were just privileged kids who had the luxury of living the carefree hippie life while their parents supported them. They didn't really care about changing the world at all. They just liked consuming rock music and hippie fashion, having casual sex, and doing drugs. Peace was obviously pointless because no matter how peaceful you are, the government will keep being at war and they'll murder your political leaders and protesters with no consequences or even a second thought. Part of the 60s rock movement in the UK was a subculture called mod, short for modern jazz. And as the hippie movement grew in the community, an offshoot that was anti-hippie formed called hard mod. Hard mod was made up of working class white people who, because of their economic status, lived in or grew up alongside immigrant communities. In the UK, at this time, those immigrant communities were largely Jamaican. Because of this, the favorite genres of hard mod were ska and reggae. At the time, a lot of the reggae and ska musicians were members of a subculture that had developed years before in Kingston called Rude Boy. The hard mods emulated them. Rude Boy was inspired by gangster movies and was associated with discontented, rowdy youths. They had a clean but hard look that contrasted the hippies hard mod hated: tight pants, dress shoes, work boots, and generally stark colors like black and white. The most important development is that in order to have hair like Rude Boys, hard mods shaved their heads. With all these things in place, they were called skinheads. Today, the term skinhead is interchangeable with Nazi, but it actually started as a celebration of Jamaican culture. The skinheads embraced reggae artists as their own, and reggae artists in turn marketed music directly to them. Hard mod petered out in the early 70s, but was revived soon after as a heavy influence on UK punk. That's how you get the various reggae tracks on Clash Records. You can see the traces of the original Rude Boy style and attitude all throughout punk. While influencing punk generally, it spawned the skinhead and ska revival within punk as well. The UK punks adopted the rude attitude into punk. With this though, they also wanted to continue what the hippies had failed to do with counterculture. They replaced peace with violence and doubled down on trying to discuss society. For this, they called anarchy, promoted graffiti, dyed their hair crazy colors, and got a bunch of piercings to discuss mainstream society. They also decided that punk was a rebellion against blues, something that was definitely not present in American punk. Blues was pervasive and tired. There was no reason why rock had to keep drawing from the same well. From now on, it was all modern music all the time. In the process of explicitly trying to be disgusting, some of the early punks started wearing swastikas and Nazi iron crosses. A lot of them would regret this, because during the same time, the swing to the right and ultra-conservative radicalization that would lead to Reagan and Thatcher was gaining strength. The neo-Nazi movement had already started to gain momentum. So these Nazis saw these symbols that punks were wearing and it went totally over their heads. They also saw the rejection of blues as meaning punk was a pure white form of rock and roll, finally free of black influence, not realizing that while it was rejecting blues, it was definitely heavily inspired sonically from Jamaican genres like ska and reggae. Nazis infested the punk scene, and since their radicalization was inspired by hating hippies for an entirely different reason than why the punks hated them, they were drawn to the anti-hippie style of the skinheads and stole it. The original skinheads and Nazi skinheads fought over the designation for years, but the Nazis pretty much beat the originals out. Either way, the fact is that when a Nazi skinhead wakes up and gets dressed today, he doesn't even realize he's dressing up like a black guy. Now, let's address why people say punk only lasted 2 years. So punk essentially became a philosophy and an idea. Anyone can make whatever kind of music they want, reject the past, and go to the future. Reject society, be rebellious. This is what made punk so influential, but it also is what set up punk for an early death. Because it was more of a philosophy than a genre, everybody had their own interpretation of it, and it causes second generation bands to break into a million little groups according to what their interpretation of the philosophy was. Also, punk's dedication to nonconformity incidentally made it extremely conformist. People had to pretend that they had never heard any music before punk. They had to hide any affinity for 60s music. Liking prog rock was a cardinal sin. People who happened to be good at their instruments had to hide any talent they had and play bad on purpose in fear of giving off the wrong image. Essentially, punk became about doing everything you could to fit a certain image, which is the least punk shit of all time. On top of this, punk was falling to the same fate as hippies at breakneck speeds. There were already London boutiques selling ripped jeans at premium prices. The rebellious core of punks were already getting antsy in 1978, but the nail was put in the coffin when Johnny Rotten quit the Sex Pistols. He did this the night after the last show of the American tour, which is on film and went like this.
No fun. This is no fun. No fun. It is no fun at all. Ever get the feeling you've been cheated?
Not only did Johnny Rotten quit, but he stopped being Johnny Rotten. He switched back to his real name, John Linden. Soon after, he formed a new band called Public Image Limited, one of the members being the original guitarist from The Clash. He said punk had become oppressive, and he also only liked disco. Soon after, Public Image Limited released their first album, which hailed the new post-punk sound. Public Image Limited definitely isn't the first post-punk band. The people who would come to define post-punk had already started their bands, but if this didn't happen, it's possible that the post-punks wouldn't have needed to have the post added to their name. They probably would have just been known as the next generation of punks, which is what they were. In the very least, the lead singer of the band, which inspired most punk bands, disavowing punk definitely complicated things. Like, imagine if when the Beatles had already gained a stranglehold over rock in '64, Paul McCartney left the band, said, "I'm not Paul anymore, I'm James McCartney. Rock music is dead, I only like big band music." And then he formed a new band with a former member of the Rolling Stones like Ian Stewart and released an album with the new evolved sound of Rubber Soul. Needless to say, everybody would have got really confused. This is what happened with punk. This is why it was declared dead, and all the new punks just renamed their genres and got super territorial about what their genre was, because they didn't want their community to follow the same fate that punk did. Really, of all the genre names, the best name is post-punk. Punk was a moment, an explosion, and there's the aftershock of everything that happened after all of the things that happened post-punk. The actual genre of post-punk itself sort of carried this idea for a while, being a mix of a bunch of different sounds, but it also eventually fell victim to people wanting to call their post-punk something new. Really, it's all post-punk. But either way, let's cover the aftermath. After punk dies, there are many different genres, but they are all intimately connected and influenced by each other. There are a lot of unique, widespread influences on post-punk, such as dub reggae and Captain Beefheart, but for the sake of time, I'll skip over that. When punk initially breaks apart, it does so in two sections. Post-punk, which happens mostly in the UK, and hardcore, which happens mainly in America. The first important thing to know about what happens in post-punk, which influences everything after after is the rise of the independent label. The mainline punk band, the Buzzcocks, released their first album, Spiral Scratch, on their own independent label called New Hormones. Now, obviously, this wasn't the first independent label. There are plenty of influential independent labels in the past. Labels like Sun and Chess Records were extremely important to early R&B, and Motown had an entire genre named after it. New Hormones was the first independent to make the fact that they were independent a main aspect of their identity. Spiral Scratch was specifically made to demystify the process of record production and inspire others to create their own labels. The Buzzcocks signed to a major right after, but the point was made, and starting in the UK, independent labels started popping up everywhere, all trying to deliver a unique sound and mission statement and encouraging others to go independent. Music journalism also moved to the hands of the people, and the landscape started to be dictated by fanzines. Zines made by random punks around the world became the tastemakers, and many members of famous bands would break into the scene initially by heading fanzines. For the first era of major post-punk bands, you can divide them into 3 sections. All of these bands are known as post-punk, but I'm just doing this because later on they divide into different genres and they do have different sounds. These sections are funk punk, proto-goth, and DIY indie. Pretty much all these bands are independent, but the DIY proto-indie bands influence the bands that will later be called indie. When the independent movement starts, a band called Desperate Bicycles are super indie.
It was easy, it was cheap, don't do it.
They record songs on rented cassette recorders and make music rudimentally using cheap toy keyboards and things like stylophones to get unique weird sounds. This will influence the idea of what we call lo-fi today. Young Marble Giants take the lo-fi sound of Desperate Bicycles and add the soft, timid voice of lead singer Allison Staton.
I've been hurt before, so knocking on my door.
Both of these bands eventually joined the label Rough Trade, who started as a record store. Rough Trade breeds a whole type of post-punk within it that pushes the DIY philosophy and, in general, creates a kind of soft punk. Rough Trade also signs artists like the Raincoats and, way farther down the line, the Smiths, and this softer punk rock inspires most of what comes to be called indie. Early punk funk is inspired by funk, obviously, though it is also inspired by a lot of krautrock and dub reggae. Disco becomes more important later to what is kind of normal punk funk, and that's why I call this early punk funk. All these bands have the bass at the center of their songs, and their music is heavily political. The Slits serve up the image of a radical feminist rabid girl gang. This is purposefully cultivated by the lead singer Ari Up to the point where the male drummer was omitted from most photos, including the album cover. Their music mixes the speed and anger of punk with dub reggae and Beefheart-inspired composition. Delta 5 and Gang of 4 have a little bit less of a dub reggae influence, but it's still there, though it's mainly replaced by an influence of funk. The music, again, is centered around the bass. The guitar is mostly designated to a kind of rhythm section or kind of texture to the sound of the song. Delta 5 is led by 2 women who both play the bass.
Can I have a taste of your ice cream? Can I lick the crumbs from your table? Can I interfere in your crisis? No, mind your own business.
Gang of 4 is the most influential band of the group. Their album Entertainment goes on to be massively inspirational, especially to the later punk funk, but also to subgenres across the board. Their radical politics, as well as the pushing of the do-it-yourself and independent lifestyle, inspire many bands down the line. Proto-goth has the sound which post-punk is most remembered for today. Inside this are The Cure, and Bauhaus, who will eventually release what's considered the first goth song, Bela Lugosi's Dead. These two bands are heavily inspired by Siouxsie and the Banshees, whose lead singer originated what would become the look of goth. No one can decide if they're post-punk or mainline punk. Some people call them proto-post-punk, which is the dumbest genre name of all time, but all you need to know is that they are important. The Cure and Bauhaus are preceded by Joy Division, who is more so inspired by the Sex Pistols. I'll be focusing mainly on them here. Joy Division is incredibly important. They cause a huge evolution throughout music. Outside of the normal post-punk influences like dub reggae and krautrock, they are also heavily inspired by The Doors, whose song The End actually inspired the coining of the term goth rock in a review. Inspired by the lyricism and music of The Doors, lead singer Ian Curtis actually lowers his voice and tries to do an American accent in order to sound like Morrison, which is why he sounds so weird.
I've been waiting for a guy to come and take me by the hand.
Joy Division's sound was dreary and emotional and pensive, and yet filled with a danceable rhythm. This would come to define goth as a genre. The themes of the songs were mental illness, existentialism, and living in the post-industrial society. Curtis suffered with his own mental illness as well, having increasingly severe epileptic fits. There's also been endless speculation about the possibility of other afflictions like bipolar. Either way, it was evident that Curtis was a deeply troubled man, and he expressed the darkness through an incredibly raw, honest, and brutal lyricism which really hadn't existed in the majority of music prior. While other bands had obviously made sad and dreary songs, Joy Division was the first popular band where the whole album was deeply personal and, to put it simply, sad, lyrically and sonically. This was only further expressed on their follow-up Closer. After the release of their first album, Unknown Pleasures, Curtis's epilepsy continued to worsen, with his fits becoming more frequent and severe. His marriage started to fall apart, and his life of now constant touring and recording while still holding a day job led to increasing feelings of isolation and self-hatred. The entire time, the band was writing their new album, and shortly after it was recorded and the band was scheduled to go on a tour of America, Curtis committed suicide. Once the album was released, everyone could tell the whole thing was essentially a 9-track suicide note. Curtis's death has been mythologized and exploited in a lot of disgusting ways, but while the fact someone is selling this in the first place is a bit perverse, the fact of the matter is there had never been such an intense musical expression of inner turmoil. The closest thing we'd had before it was the Beach Boys' Pet Sounds, and even that can't compare to lyrics like this on Isolation.
Mother, I cried, you believe me. I'm doing the best that I can. I'm ashamed of the things I've been put through. I'm ashamed of the person I am. Isolation.
And that's just the opening track. While it may seem a bit disturbing to some, you have to think about how it must feel for someone feeling the sense of isolation Curtis was to hear him express feeling the same thing. Curtis's bandmate referred to isolation as a letter from a separate world. For a listener that's found themselves trapped in that world, the song itself is a confirmation that there's someone else present there. Closer opened the floodgates for musicians to express the dark and ugly intimate details of their inner world. Without Closer, you'd never get the intensely personal raw emotions of artists like Elliott Smith, Fiona Apple, and PJ Harvey in the 90s. The dark personal sound of bands like Nirvana and Radiohead, up to the less fatalistic but still deeply real and personal music of modern indie folk artists like Mitski and Phoebe Bridgers. To put it in an extremely simplistic and reductive manner, Joy Division popularized making sad music about being depressed. Now, let's go back to 77 and over to America. First of all, there's something I haven't mentioned, and that's New Wave. When the second generation of punks came around, the term New Wave and post-punk were considered interchangeable. New Wave just meant that there was the first wave of punk bands like the Ramones and the Sex Pistols, and this was the second wave, a new wave. When the new generations of CBGB's bands, notably Blondie and Talking Heads, were signed by major labels, the label decided that the term New Wave would be easier to market than anything that included the word punk, because punk was scary. So they took the term New Wave and ran with it. Blondie and the Talking Heads are essentially just post-punk bands, but when Blondie released their album Parallel Lines in '78 and broke the punk sound into the mainstream in a way it had never been before, with hit singles like Heart of Glass, Blondie and New Wave became the symbol of the commercialization of punk and everything wrong with it. On top of this, New York punk never really had the anarchist sound of the UK. In the eyes of a lot of people in the downtown New York scene, the CBGB's punk was actually conservative, mostly wanted to call back to the music of the 60s before psychedelic and glam rock. This inspired a reaction with the desire to make music with a sound so grating and weird that it could never be commercialized. Most of the first era of New York no wave was lost to time, never being recorded. It's mainly remembered by one compilation album with 4 bands produced by Brian Eno because he wanted to capture the moment. No New York. Lady to Lunch is a 16-year-old runaway who fronts Teenage Jesus and the Jerks. James Chance fronts the Contortions, and the other 2 bands are DNA and Mars. They're all very loud and very noisy, and Lady to Lunch especially completely forgoes singing, doubling down on the essentially spoken word poetry of Patti Smith, replacing the slight melodic voice with simply yelling. All these bands followed and they yelled too. Everyone was really loud and everyone was yelling. Across the country in California, punk had died, and most of the people in the major cities had replaced it with the post-punk of Joy Division and Gang of Four. Punks from the suburbs thought the overt politics of Gang of Four and the verbose dreariness of Joy Division was pretentious. They decided to take what punk originally gave them, turn it up to speed, and infuse the music with the attitude of the snotty teenager. Black Flag takes a note from the English DIY bands and start their own label called SST. They also start calling the numbers on the back of punk records and ask whoever answers if they have a place around them that would hire them for a gig. Through this, they forged the indie tour circuit, which would support underground bands and cultivate scenes throughout the entire country outside of major cities like New York, LA, and San Francisco. You never get scenes in places like Seattle or Olympia without this happening. The Minutemen are a part of the early California hardcore scene as well. Minutemen, while called hardcore, integrate a lot more aspects of British post-punk, especially in their Gang of Four inspired political statements. While Black Flag had been inspired to do DIY, Minutemen became preachers of DIY, and they spread the philosophy of DIY throughout the entire scene. With this hailing of DIY in combination with their softer form of hardcore, Minutemen go on to be the basis of what becomes known as American indie. Their label signs Husker Du, who coined the genre name. Husker Du inspires the Pixies, who will in turn be one of the main sonic influences of Nevermind down the line. Their experimentations with time signatures on double nickels on the dime become the basis of math rock.
Guarding the Holy Cupid.
Bands like Black Flag, the Dead Kennedys, and the Descendants spearhead the early hardcore movement, but this is more so the kind of angry teenager punk sound which would live on in California and eventually become pop punk with bands like Green Day. Black Flag still hadn't released their first full-length album, and the sound, which really defined hardcore, wasn't in California yet. In DC, in '77, a jazz fusion band called Mind Power was introduced to the Ramones and decided to pivot into punk music. Renaming themselves after a Ramones song, they were reinvented as Bad Brains. During the transitionary period, they make more traditional punk music. In '78, the New York no wave bands were getting yelly and experimental. A few states over, Bad Brains also became yelly and experimental. They speed up punk to tempos never reached before on the West Coast and develop a rage-filled snarling scream for vocal delivery. With this, Bad Brains, an all-black band, developed the sound for what would become known as one of the whitest genres, hardcore. They cultivated the DC hardcore scene, and two of their disciples within the scene were teenagers Henry Garfield and Ian MacKaye. In the 80s, Garfield went to a Black Flag show in New York, and knowing they'd let audience members come on stage to take the mic before, he asked to perform a song. He came on stage and performed a Black Flag song with the snarling vocal delivery of HR from Bad Brains, and the band thought it was perfect. They asked him to come on full-time as singer. He changed his name to Henry Rollins and brought the DC hardcore sound to California. He'd lead Black Flag's first full-length album, in which the band would fully adopt the DC sound and cement what would be defined as hardcore across the country. Ian MacKaye stayed in DC and started the band Minor Threat. Being minors and having minors as friends, the normal music venues of bars and clubs barred them from entry and performance. They'd still sneak in, but he didn't like having to do that. MacKaye convinced promoters to mark underage kids' hands with X's so the bartenders would know not to serve them, creating the practice of all-age shows. Afterwards, he'd make a song called Straight Edge about abstaining from drugs and alcohol, and it inadvertently caused an entire sobriety movement that still exists today. Bad Brains moved to New York, and the power vacuum made Minor Threat the leader of DC hardcore, though they'd break up soon after.
Datzelfde gebeurde toen hij opnieuw in de New Wave clubs probeerde. En het is zo gebleven. Ook deze week in het Amsterdamse Paradiso wist James White de woede op te wekken van een deel van het publiek.
Sure, my name is Harold, and you'll be back for a taste.
Back in New York, no wave was becoming funkier. James Chance with the Contortions wanted to make music that was a punk version of James Brown, so he changed his name to James White, because he was white. The Death to Disco movement had started, mostly being motivated by racism and homophobia. Naturally, when everyone decided they hated disco, the no-wave bands decided the most punk thing to do was to start making disco music. At the same time, with the release of Saturday Night Fever, the Midtown disco scene, which was originally a space mainly for the gay community, was being invaded by straights from Long Island who wanted to be John Travolta. The gay community moved downtown with the punks. In Athens, Georgia, a band consisting mostly of gay men and straight women called the B-52s listened to Entertainment by Gang of Four, and they took the sound, replacing the political elements with camp. They forged the Athens scene, which would become home to R.E.M., and created a second home in New York at the downtown gay club Paradise Garage. Many of the bands came through Paradise Garage emulated the B-52 style. Throughout the early 80s, no wave transforms into noise, mutant disco, new punk funk, all pretty much just names for what was punk dance music. Bands like Liquid Liquid and ESG define this era, going on to influence a wide variety of genres, including hip-hop, house, EDM, and just general pop music. They get sampled on hip-hop classics like White Lines,
bass,
and Ain't No Half Steppin',
I'm with this. I'm just gonna sit here laid back to this nice mellow beat.
Some of the other notable bands from this time include bands like Conk,
I look at you, and I know you're mine. And I run my finger through your curl.
And Lizzie Musser. And also, yeah.
Fire, I bid you to burn. Fire,
For a few years, hip-hop, punk, and disco are all in conversation with each other in New York. It's an unprecedented explosion of creativity and cross-genre collaboration. Grace Jones, a singer who made disco transitions into new wave, her first single including a cover of Joy Division. Warm Leatherette becomes a template for the punk, funk, disco, and R&B fusion that would be carried on by Michael Jackson and Prince on their rock-flavored albums Thriller and Purple Rain. Donna adopts the new wave sound as well, and also takes the style of earlier post-punk women like Debbie Harry, of Blondie, and Ariel of the Slits. Those three artists define what pop music is from then on, and their redefinitions all have some roots in post-punk. In reaction to no wave essentially becoming a punk form of disco, there's a new generation of downtown New York bands that goes back to being loud and making weird sounding noises. The most prominent bands within the scene are Swans, and Sonic Youth.
Me to come along as you sing your song, you're fucking with me.
Sonic Youth would go on to be one of the most influential American indie bands of all time. Kim Gordon manages to be one of the only accepted female songwriters in the American hardcore scene in the early 80s. They innovate new sounds of music and influence bands from then on. There's still people influenced by Sonic Youth today. In the 90s, they also paved the road to the death of most indie labels. Sonic Youth signed to a major in the 90s and ended up getting full creative control while also getting the financial benefits of being with a major. The template of this contract is essentially what ended up being used for all the independent bands that were courted by the majors. The fact at all that Sonic Youth was on a major led for major cred for the label and major labels in general. If Sonic Youth is signing to a major, then there's probably nothing bad about it. This changed the usual attitude against major labels, and a lot more bands that had been supporting the many indie labels just went to majors as soon as they got a slight amount of success. This sounds bad, but who cares? Sonic Youth is still really sick. So I don't care. I haven't even covered synthpop, and I'm not going to for the sake of time, but this is essentially the foundation for the modern music landscape. Ian MacKaye goes on to form a new band called Rites of Spring. Inspired by Joy Division, they have a more emotional form of hardcore that people call emo-core. Eventually, the bands that follow their influence shorten it to emo. Rites of Spring break up, and soon after, MacKaye forms Fugazi, which come to define the genre alternative. Black Flag eventually released the album My War, where they indulged their heavy metal influences more. This more heavy metal inspired hardcore inspired the Seattle band Green River. That band breaks up and two of its members form Pearl Jam and the other forms Mudhoney. Mudhoney popularized the sound of grunge, and their label, which carried Soundgarden, signs a band called Nirvana. Nirvana's first album, Bleach, carries the heavy metal influences of the rest of Seattle grunge. 2 towns over, in Olympia, a band called Beat Happening, is inspired by the lo-fi and indie music of Rough Trade. They start making music that sounds poorly produced on purpose, and forge a form of soft punk rock which is essentially bedroom pop, and sounds like something that would be the sound of a TikTok about someone's morning routine.
Just a boy playing possum. We'll come back for Indian summer. We'll come back for Indian summer.
It's in this scene that the American indie of Minutemen and Husker Du combines together with Rough Trade's UK indie. This soft rock is a breath of fresh air in the extremely macho, hardcore-dominated landscape of the American underground, one of the only underground scenes that actually cite bands led by women as important. It's the scene that cultivates Riot Grrrl. Kurt Cobain is influenced by all the indie rock in Olympia. With Olympia's appreciation for wide ranges of music and Sonic Youth's record-collecting scene-spanning philosophies, Cobain breaks the cycle of vehement genre adherence. He takes influences from scenes all across America, like Mission of Burma and Pixies in Boston, and the college rock perpetuated by R.E.M., and fuses the sound with the grunge of Bleach. The result is Nevermind. The American mainstream gets exposed to everything that had been brewing in the underground for a decade and a half, and they think Kurt Cobain invented it. That's an incredibly abridged outline of the Sex Pistols to Nirvana, and I omitted a ton of super important moments and bands, but in the very least, I hope I gave a little bit of a window into this incredibly complicated era of music, and I hope you have a little bit more of an idea of how and why punk music was important, and some bands that you're interested in listening to.
I touch your hem, you say.